Welcome back to the class. We are continuing with the previous classes discussion on alternative globalizations, and we were discussing a very specific topic of the idea of counter-hegemonic globalization by Peter Evans. So he was arguing that the kind of a globalization that we are encountering today, that is a neoliberal globalization, is not natural, it's not given, it's not inevitable. Rather, it can be challenged, and he proposes that three families of movements, starting with the labor movement and the women's movement and then environmental movements, are really capable of bringing a very powerful alliance of peoples and organizations from across the globe. So we were discussing about the way in which the jobs have been informalized in a globalized world, especially when it's run on the base of neoliberal policies. And also we were discussing about how women are at a very disadvantageous position in a neoliberal policies, because it's least sensitive to these questions of gender issues and other questions. So even now, vast majority of women's work is unrecognized and it's unacknowledged, it's underpaid, or many times it's even unpaid. So that he believes really requires to change. So let's continue with that line of discussion. So women's organizations have an advantage over transnational labor movements, as in that they do not have to transcend a zero-sum logic equivalence to that of the geography of jobs, which would put the gendered interest of women in one region in conflict with those of the another region. One of his very important, interesting observation is that, see, for example, for labor issues, laborers from another region could be a threat of laborers in one particular region. We have seen that when laborers are taken, when migrants are coming in as laborers, many times they come in conflict with the laborers of that particular region. Or when the companies shift their entire operation from one locality to the another locality, again it becomes a kind of an issue between laborers of one region to the other. But whereas in the case of women's movement do not really face that. The other women of other countries, they are not a kind of threat or challenge or competition to these women. So this geography hardly matters when it comes to feminist movements as well as environmental movements. Like the labor movement, the women's movement's ideological foundations are rooted in a discourse of human rights. But transnational feminism, much more than in the labor movement, has wrestled with the contradictions of building politics around the universalistic language of rights. We know that the feminist politics have always been using this whole idea of rights, that women's rights are universal rights, women's rights are human rights. So they would like to present it as a universal right, that women across the globe have similar kind of rights. But while it is important to present it as human rights, feminist theory has already discussed extensively that beyond this assertion, there are very context-specific cultural issues. For example, the whole idea about black feminism. Okay, when you bring in color, when you bring in race, when you bring in religion, when you bring in caste, when you bring in region, when you bring in ethnicity, then the women's issues are significantly different from each other. So at the same time, you can use this universalist language of human rights. At the same time, that should not make you oblivious to more deeper context-specific issues of differences. An incredible gamut of geographic, cultural and class locations. Any earlier naive assumptions that there was a single one-size-fits-all global feminist agenda have been replaced by appreciation that the goal is much more complex. We know that from 1990s onwards, the whole black feminism, rise of black feminism in the US, and in India as well, we had its resonance in the form of Dalit feminism. Okay, so the questions, the kind of issues faced by an upper caste woman and a Dalit woman are entirely different. And then again, the questions of poverty, the questions of economic inequality, a host of other issues. When you complicate this scenario with more and more variables, we realize that the realm, the field is much more fraught and cannot be really equated with easier ones. So, precarious participation in the informal economy, a vast arena in which the traditional organizational tools of transnational labor movement are least likely to be effective. Women in the informal sector experience the insecurity and lack of social contract that appear to be the neoliberal destiny of all but a small minority of the workforce, regardless of gender. So, this kind of a social contract that a formal workplace setting promises is only limited to very few number of people. It's limited to few section of people, and vast majority of the population, including men and women, have been pushed into this informal economy, where there's hardly anything exists between the employer and the employee. I'm sure that you are familiar with this putting out system, where where women in their own household do some kind of part-time work from their own house, and then some agent comes and then gives them all the ingredients and then raw materials, and after a couple of days they will come and then take the finished goods and pay them for a particular piece. So, all these are contributing to the kind of economic insecurity and vulnerability of the people. Aggressive efforts to expand the idea of the social contract into informal sector is mandatory. So, that's the whole idea. How do you provide, how do you ensure a legal security net for these women, because they are not covered under PF, they are not covered under pension, they don't have any social security rules and regulations, their working hours are not regulated. So, how do we tackle this is a major question. The examples of self-employed women's association, SEVA. So, he gives the example of a very fascinating experience started in India. The SEVA as an organizational form starting in India and then spreading to South Africa, Turkey and other countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia and Africa, and eventually creating incipient international networks such as HomeNet and StreetNet. I would urge you to look up for these initiatives, very fascinating initiatives. The story of SEVA itself is something very interesting. So, it is there as an example, as an example of something that started in India and then later became transnational, which very effectively intervenes in women's life and try to redress their issues to a large extent. And the third one that Peter Evans talks about is environmental concerns. So, this environmental stewardship is almost by definition a collective issue, and therefore an issue that should lend itself to collective mobilization. The point that we mentioned earlier, that environmental issues are global issues by default. No individual country, no individual group will be able to resolve it. It requires global collaboration. It requires global efforts to bring in some kind of solution or some kind of ways of addressing with that. However, there is this formidable gap that separates the South's environmentalism of the poor, in which the sustainability means above all else sustaining the ability of resource-dependent local communities to extract livelihood from their natural surroundings, and the conservationist agenda of the traditional northern environmental groups, which favors the preservation of fauna and flora without much regard to how this conservation impacts the livelihood of surrounding communities. Now, so the whole question is in terms of environmental concerns, he is bringing in this whole kind of a kind of a conflict between the global north and the global south, terms which are used to roughly indicate the European and the first world countries and the rest of the societies. The global north would invariably include the USA, Canada and the European societies, and the global south would include almost every other countries. So, here their environmental priorities are different. For example, the sustainability means above all else sustaining the ability of resource dependent local communities to extract livelihood from their natural surrounding. That's the case for the poorer countries. In a poorer country like India, forest is an important resource. We will be forced to use coal because coal is cheap and abundantly available. Because even though we know that coal is something that is creating quite a lot of pollution, but we don't have other alternative source of energy, so we use coal, and because for us the development of the poorer section is important. So there is the poor countries are always really forced to strike a balance between their ecological concerns and the livelihood issues for their vulnerable communities. Whereas for the north, they have more, they are at the luxury of not having to really worry too much about their sustainability or the kind of resources for the vulnerable communities. Rather, they can say that all this flora and fauna have to be protected, it should not be exploited. So this, how do developmental initiatives will have very different responses from very affluent countries and less affluent countries is something very important. Some issues such as global warming and ozone layer seems intrinsically global, whereas the politics of others such as the health consequences of toxic dumps can be intensely local. We know that ozone layer, the depletion of ozone layer is a threat to every country, and rising global temperature is a threat to every other country. At the same time, dumping of toxic waste material from America to a port town in India or a port town in Bangladesh could be a very local issue. The challenges of building a global organization that effectively integrates socially focused activities with global campaigns would seem particularly challenging in the case of the environmental movement. As the labor and women's movements are able to leverage the ideological powers of abstract concepts like human rights and democracy, environmentalists can claim an impeccable universal agenda of saving the planet and invoke scientific analysis as validating their position. So, these are the global, larger universalistic slogans like democracy, human rights, saving the planets, and scientific analysis. Peter Evans believes that these movements, widespread movements, will have the wherewithal to bring in a wide variety of actors and organizations to under one umbrella and to think about a counter-hegemonic globalization. Now, let us spend some time trying to make sense of this global justice movement. Maybe starting the first World Social Forum held in Porto Alegre in Brazil in January 2001, 2002, European Social Forum in Florence in France, the 2004 World Social Forum in Mumbai, and 2005 World Social Forum in Porto Alegre again in Brazil mark the three high points of this period of the global justice movement. So, as I mentioned in the previous class, this World Social Forum is a very interesting, it was a very interesting, collective. It was a very interesting spectacle of people from across the globe coming and then, protesting and then sharing visions of alternative world, those things. The global justice movement has expanded geographically, but at the same time, the 2006 polycentric World Social Forum held in Bamako in Mali, Caracas, the capital city of Venezuela, and Karachi, and the 2007 World Social Forum in Nairobi were in many respects less successful than the previous events. The integration of grassroots activists diminished, while NGOs and activists who supported formal political actors and regimes became more prominent. So again, it's a very interesting thing to see why that particular movement lost its steam, and why that it no longer is able to attract the kind of grassroots level organizations. Rather, it's been taken over by large NGOs which have ostensible political backing or support from political parties. So, global justice activists saw that the battle against the neoliberalism plays out primarily in the realm of ideas, and that ideological changes is the basis for sustainable social transformation. From the point of view of development, it is not so much money which counts, but as ideas. Their success in challenging the dominant ideology is based on testing whether neoliberalism has lived up to its own values of democracy and scientific rationality. So we know that neoliberalism really promised a free world of ideas, free world of democracy, of dissent, of diverse opinion, and then rationality, scientific rationality. But the whole question, the mute question is, does neoliberalism really stand up to its own values of this democracy and scientific rationality? Global justice economics move from a discursive emphasis on poverty and suffering to an analysis of economic inequality, focusing on the logic of social conflict and social agency. Poverty is thus not fatal, but a consequence of the dominant economic model, that is capitalism, and the unequal distribution of wealth that impoverishes poor and the working of people around the globe. Global justice activists insist that poverty needs not be endemic and suggest relatively inexpensive ways to alleviate or eradicate it. So they have very, very, especially we know that we are now producing more than sufficient stuff to feed the whole world. Food grains are being produced more, especially India is producing surplus food grain, but still we have large section of population reeling under poverty. Children are malnourished, malnutrition is rampant. So it's not the question of supply, but then there is a host of other issues, other systemic issues, social and economic and cultural issues which stand in between these poorest of the poor from acquiring their nutritions and then food. So they change these political discourses in such a manner that more innovative, more radical ideas are necessary to ensure a more egalitarian world or global justice. So global justice activists attempt to reinsert social and political questions into the issues treated by neoliberal economics as solely involved with the maximization of efficiency. We know that it's a very interesting thing. It's a very sad thing as well, because when the development discourse was analyzed, or when economists sit and then discuss about their policy, they seems to be working only on the basis of economic rationality. As I mentioned, the questions of cultural and social aspects, the whole questions of political questions, representation, the questions of citizenship rights, all these things were seen as irrelevant or as a kind of a irritants. I'm using that word again and again because that's how many of the economic planners really look at that. But now we realize that the whole singular rationality of economics, that the maximization of profit will be a panacea for every problem, that particular assumption has simply failed. That assumption has simply failed, and increasingly we are realizing that these political and social questions are relevant. They denounce the imposition of neoliberalism by non-accountable experts and barely democratic institutions. To build a fairer world, they argue for the notion of an active rather than passive citizenship, requiring a public familiar with the scientific knowledge and debates, especially in public economics. So economics should not be treated as the realm of a select experts with all kind of jargons and then statistics and other things, so that it looks so difficult. But the whole argument about public economics, that it must be the public must be able to engage with it, must be able to deliberate on it, is something very, very important argument. As major bodies manage the transition to a more global society, the G8, G20, World Bank, IMF and WTO are the core targets of global justice activists. To their mind, these institutions have come to embody both the neoliberal ideology and the technocratic aspects of current global governance. So, these are the two very important terms that you need to keep in mind. One is neoliberal ideology, we have discussed. Second one is this technocratic maybe mindset or techno-managerial way of doing things, which is preoccupied with the questions of efficiency. The belief that technology can solve all social problems, the refusal or insensitivity to cultural and social questions, or insensitivity to history, or lack of any respect or regards to the kind of a social or cultural realms of human beings, and a very mechanical instrumentalist use of technology and other things. So these things can be a kind of a deadly combination. It can be a deadly concoction which can bring in quite a lot of negative results. So so we see the global justice activists now believe that it's time to focus on implementing concrete alternatives. And three alternatives that they suggest is to citizens and experts advocacy networks, citizens to not to live as a kind of very passive citizen, but to take the role of active citizens, citizens who are conscious of their rights, citizens who really are sensitive to their surroundings, who think about the future, think about different imaginations, and a focus on local level community development through local autonomy, participatory self-government, alternate education systems, and improvement in the quality of life. Set of focus set to the local level. How can you think differently? How can you educate your children differently? How can you take care of your health differently? How can you produce your food differently? How can you create a self-sufficient community differently? So focusing on the grassroots and supporting the progressive regimes. There is another set of very important set saying that without political power you won't be able to do anything. So you have the responsibility to support the progressive, democratic, environmentally friendly political outfits and regimes rather than its enemies. So resistance to globalization is also occurring in the form of extreme right political movements that seek to defend ideas such as a frontier-style self-determination, national isolationism, and fundamentalist culture against what they perceive as the growing imposition of total global governance in some case, or modern liberal and secular culture in others. So this is again which we will discuss in the coming classes as well. There is a global proliferation of fundamentalist groups who want to protect their own culture from the invasion of others, people who are against the ideas of secularism, people who are against the ideas of the universal discourse of rights. So they are really feeling threatened under this global scenario, and they want to really stop the process of globalization. Since the 1990s, there have been a dramatic rise in the fascist groups and ultra-nationalist and xenophobic politics in European countries, USA, and many other nations. And I'm not going to elaborate this. We will come back to this later. But we know that in every country for the last 10 or 15 years, these right-wing political parties who are ultra-nationalist. It's not about the nationalism, but it's about ultra-nationalist, very violent kind of nationalist groups have come up in several countries, in Germany, in the US, in several other countries. So, promises of a borderless world now looks less plausible. The whole idea that a nation state will lose its significance and other things, it looks very, very weak now. The Trump phenomenon in the US and the lingering influence of Trumpism despite his electoral defeat. You know that those who are follow the developments in the US will realize that the kind of sentiments that Donald Trump represented with a mix of fundamentalist Christian beliefs, very protectionist economic ideas, and a tendency sentiments against people coming in. So these are all will and a very, very big dose of white supremacy. So they are going to continue. They will linger in the US culture, and then it's very difficult to fight that. And so there is a heightening sentiment against migrants, refugees, international laborers. We know the story of a Mexican wall and how he changed the visa rules. So that's the kind of society that we are in. And then strengthening religious fundamentalism across the globe and its implication. Again, another, I don't want to go into that now due to the paucity of time, but the religious fundamentalism, religious violence across religions, including Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, across the globe, we are witnessing that. So the whole argument is the kind of an enforced cosmopolitization, as what Ulrich Beck would call, that you are becoming cosmopolitan, but it's not a voluntary cosmopolitanism, but it's an enforced cosmopolitization. You're forced to become cosmopolitan. You are because of migrant laborers, because of refugees, because of tourists, you are supposed to encounter with the other in your everyday life, even including inside your own house. So that enforced cosmopolitization will have kind of backlash. It's what we are actually witnessing today. So this whole let me wind up now. This whole phenomenon of anti-globalization, the sentiments against anti-globalization, the movements against anti-globalization is a very, very fascinating area for you to explore, because it tells you why that there is a resistance against globalization, what are the ideological premises from which this opposition is articulated, and it also tells you what are the alternatives, what are the kind of an alternative imaginations that different sections of people have about a much better future, better kind of a more beautiful world for the future generations. Okay, so let us stop here and we'll come back for the next class. Thank you.